Why is Belarus not a part of Russia? This question seems simple, but it leads us into centuries of history, wars, shifting borders, and cultural identity that shaped Belarus into the nation it is today. To understand why Belarus stands as an independent state, we have to travel back to the early medieval world, where the first foundations of both Russia and Belarus were being laid. The earliest major political entity in this region was the Kievan Rus. Beginning in the mid-9th century, it was a federation of Slavic tribes centered around the city of Kiev, which at the time held sway over much of modern Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. According to an old chronicle compiled in the 12th century, local Slavic tribes invited a Scandinavian leader named Rurik to rule over them. Whether this legend is completely true or partly myth, the dynasty that began with Rurik became one of the most influential families in Eastern European history. It lasted for centuries, producing rulers like Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, who would later declare himself the first Tsar of Russia. During the Kievan Rus period, religion transformed the land. Vladimir I, who ruled at the turn of the first millennium, decided to abandon the traditional Slavic pagan gods like Perun the thunder god, and instead converted to Orthodox Christianity. This moment was monumental. Christianity began spreading across the lands of modern-day Belarus and Russia, binding them together under a shared faith that still defines the region today. As centuries passed, the political map began to shift. After the decline of Kievan Rus, new centers of power emerged. One of the most important for the lands we now call Belarus was the rise of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. By the mid-13th century, a ruler named Mindaugas had managed to consolidate power over Polotsk, Vitebsk, and Minsk. This became a vast realm stretching far across Eastern Europe. It was ethnically diverse but heavily Slavic in culture. It was around this time that the term Belarus, meaning white Ruthenia, first appeared. Some historians believe the word white was used to distinguish it from black Ruthenia, which lay under Mongol influence. The Mongol invasions that swept across Eastern Europe in the 13th century changed everything. Though the Mongols controlled much of the region, their grip weakened over time, and Lithuania expanded southward all the way to Kiev. This made the Grand Duchy of Lithuania a major regional power. Its eastern neighbor Muscovy, however, was rising rapidly as well. In 1380, Muscovite forces under Grand Duke Dmitry Donskoy defeated the Mongols at the Battle of Kulikovo Field. Although the Mongols were not completely expelled, this marked the beginning of Muscovy's rise and eventually laid the groundwork for the Russian Empire. Belarusian lands, however, remained tied to Lithuania and Poland. In 1385, the Lithuanian Grand Duke Jogaila entered into a political marriage with the Queen of Poland, uniting the two realms. This created the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, a powerful state that lasted for centuries. One condition of this marriage was Jogaila's conversion to Christianity and the imposition of Roman Catholicism across Lithuania. Pagan traditions were officially banned, yet most of the local population in Belarus remained faithful to Orthodox Christianity. The cultural divide between Catholic Poland and Orthodox Belarus would continue to shape identity long into the future. The situation dramatically changed in the late 18th century. The once mighty Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth weakened and was partitioned between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. In the Third Partition of 1795, Belarusian lands were absorbed into the Russian Empire. This was a turning point. Russian rule meant new administration laws and language policies. Russian became the language of court, schools, and government. Orthodox Christianity was strengthened, and Belarus was divided into 5 provinces. Under Russian rule, investments were made in canals, roads, and infrastructure. Yet for many Belarusians, this period also marked the loss of autonomy. The 19th century brought turbulence. The Russian Empire modernized, but was also marked by repression. In 1834, the Russian language became compulsory in courts and schools. This reduced the official use of the Belarusian language and culture, while Belarus was integrated more tightly into the empire. Nationalist sentiments in Eastern Europe grew. A sense of Belarusian identity remained, even if it was overshadowed by Russian influence. The 20th century shook Belarus to its core. World War I tore apart the Russian Empire. German and Austro-Hungarian armies invaded Belarusian territory, and nationalist groups sought opportunities to push for independence. In March 1918, the Belarusian People's Republic was declared, yet it survived only briefly before being absorbed by the Bolsheviks, who had seized power in the Russian Revolution. By 1922, Belarus was one of the founding republics of the Soviet Union. Early Soviet policy initially allowed some degree of ethnic and cultural expression. The Belarusian language was promoted in schools and administration from the 1920s into the early 1930s. More Belarusians gained positions of power within the Soviet government of their republic, but this changed when Joseph Stalin consolidated power. By the mid-1930s, Russian language and culture once again dominated. Schools shifted to teaching Russian. The Cyrillic alphabet was imposed and local autonomy was crushed. Then came World War II for Belarus. The war was catastrophic. In 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, invading Soviet territory. Belarus lay directly in the path of destruction. The country lost more than a quarter of its entire population during the war. The Jewish community in particular was devastated. Before the war, there were around 1 million Jews in Belarus. By 1943, between 600,000 and 800,000 had been killed. The Holocaust erased centuries of Jewish life in Belarus today, only a small community remains. After the war, Belarus was rebuilt as a Soviet republic. Heavy industry grew, cities expanded, and Belarus became a vital part of the Soviet system, yet the scars of the war lingered as the decades passed. Russian influence continued to overshadow Belarusian identity. The Russian language became dominant in education, administration, and daily life. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 gave Belarus independence. On July 27, 1990, it declared sovereignty, and on August 25, 1991, independence was officially recognized, yet independence did not mean a clean break with Russia. Belarus remained economically, culturally, and politically tied to its eastern neighbor. In 1999, more than 85% of Belarusians considered Belarusian their native language, but most people increasingly spoke Russian in daily life. By 2019, only 28% said they used Belarusian at home. The Russian language dominated television, newspapers, and education. Politically, Belarus, under its long-serving President Alexander Lukashenko, pursued close ties with Moscow. In 1995, Belarus and Russia signed a treaty of friendship and cooperation to deepen economic and military ties. In 1996, another treaty created the Community of Russia and Belarus, followed in 1997 by the Union of Belarus and Russia. These agreements aimed at integrating the two countries more closely in foreign policy, security, and economy. In 2000, the Union State Treaty was finalized, which in theory could one day merge both nations into a single state. At the same time, Belarus joined other Moscow-led organizations such as the Collective Security Treaty Organization alongside Russia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. In economics, Belarus became part of the Eurasian Economic Union in 2015, further deepening integration with Russia. Relations with the West, on the other hand, grew colder. The Belarusian government faced criticism for human rights abuses and lack of democracy. Western sanctions pushed Belarus closer to Russia. The 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine highlighted just how close this relationship had become. Belarus allowed Russian forces to use its territory for military operations and hosted Russian tactical nuclear weapons. Starting in 2023, economically, Russia dominates Belarusian trade, making up over 60% of exports and imports. So why is Belarus not simply a part of Russia today? The answer lies in its long history. Belarus developed its own identity shaped by Orthodox Christianity, by centuries of rule under Lithuania and Poland, and by its tragic experiences in war and occupation. It became part of the Russian Empire, but it never lost a distinct culture and language. The Soviet Union reinforced Belarusian dependence on Moscow, but also allowed Belarus to exist as a separate republic. That status ultimately made it possible for Belarus to declare independence in 1990. Today, Belarus stands at a crossroads. Some believe it will eventually be absorbed into Russia through the Union state framework. Others argue that Belarus might one day turn westward toward the European Union and away from Moscow. For now, the country maintains a delicate balance. Officially, it is independent, yet in practice, its politics, economy, and security remain tied tightly to Russia. The history of Belarus shows us that borders and nations are never simple. The land has been contested by empires, scarred by wars, and shaped by different faiths and cultures. And while Belarus and Russia share a deep and inseparable past, the story of Belarus also proves that history alone does not erase identity. Even under immense pressure, Belarus has remained its own country. With every century, its people have carried forward a sense of who they are, distinct yet connected to their powerful eastern neighbor. And so the answer to why Belarus is not part of Russia is that history made it possible for Belarus to emerge as something both connected to and separate from Russia. The shared roots in Kievan Rus, the centuries under Lithuania and Poland, the tragedies of the world wars, the Soviet experience, and the post-Soviet treaties with Moscow all show how closely tied the two remain. Yet Belarus survives as a nation of its own, perhaps small and dependent, yet determined to keep its name on the map. The future remains uncertain, but the past makes one thing clear: Belarus is not simply Russia, it is Belarus.